The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 42. Down the Sink. Rob and I had been living together since the beginning of 1988, and the morning I told him I was pregnant with his child, he told me to get an abortion and he would pay for it. His demeanour said he thought he was being gallant, but I wondered if he really thought his generosity should be commended. I yanked his favourite print from the wall, a black and white photograph of a blonde sitting on the edge of a chair pulling off her fishnet stockings, and I threw it on the floor. But the glass only cracked and did not shatter as I had hoped. Rob's lack of reaction was disappointing. He was more concerned with finding the aspirin. Several minutes later, I watched as he pulled a wad of money from his pocket. A few pieces of paper with other women's phone numbers on them fluttered to the floor. While all this was going on, Tracy Chapman was singing Fast Car in the background. I walked past him and into the living room to smoke a cigarette. I could see the ocean from there and hoped it would calm me. I sat on the couch that he and his soon-to-be ex-wife had jointly purchased. I always thought I could smell her perfume on it. Rob went to the pub, and when he came back drunk, he wanted to have sex. It was at this time that I began to visit a couple of local churches, small spaces with only occasional parishioners frequenting in between formal services. No one bothered me. I always sat in the front row pews and assured God I was sorry for what I was about to do. I realised the still small voice was again audible when I was in church and focused on the divine, calming me, soothing me. In those moments of quiet, I understood that every woman who permits her fetus to be sucked down a sink does so in spite of the maternal instincts that made civilization possible, and the voice in my head said, "I am the comforter. Your fetus is just a bunch of cells that will not suffer their destruction. God does not permit a soul to enter any fetus that will not eventually become a fully developed human being." Despite these words of reassurance, fear still grabbed my awareness, and I prayed to Jesus, who was wearing a loincloth and staring down at me from the cross above the pulpit, for forgiveness. I was either scared of being punished for what I knew I was about to do, or hedging my bets. When I told my mother my predicament, I had no choice but to play it off with a measured degree of nonchalance, because I generally avoided risking her disapproval. She had never liked Rob anyway, and if pushed, she would have said something like, "Well, what the hell did you expect, for God's sake?" I would have aborted my fetus the following day had it been up to me, but the doctor said that the fetus had to be 8 weeks old, so nothing gets left behind. During the 3-week interim, I carried on flying and drank a lot of alcohol to stay numb. I lost a lot of weight too. I had to go to a new uniform fitting. I lied about the reason I'd lost weight, making up some story about getting salmonella in Malaysia. Whiston's Ladies' Hospital was where my pregnancy was terminated. I was due to have the abortion at 11 a.m, but I couldn't stop crying, and so it had to be delayed. I did not recognise that I was mourning, experiencing grief in its most potent form. I couldn't understand why I was crying so much, because I had never cried that much, not ever about anything. The nurse covered my hand with hers, and soon both our hands were shaking. She told me that I didn't have to go through with it. I felt dirty and careless, and every one of my tears was not just a product of mourning, but a representation of self-disgust. Why had I done this to myself? When the doctor came in to see me, I realised that he would send me home if I didn't show signs of being more mentally stable, and so I willed myself to dry-eyed silence. After the abortion, I woke up in a very large room amid 20 or so other occupants of Victorian brass beds, a cross-section of women who had also ended their pregnancies for their various reasons. Although I could not hear the specifics of the few conversations going on around me, and some of the women were sleeping and some were just staring into space, there was an unspoken camaraderie in that dormitory. The lady propped up in the bed next to mine told me it was her 5th time at Whiston's, and that she already had 4 kids. She almost sounded vitriolic, as if she had won a battle of some kind. I was told by the nurses to rest for the remainder of the afternoon. I couldn't wait to leave. The place smelled like a wound. My dad and Shirley were due to pick me up at 5. It was the first time ever I was looking forward to lying on their gold settee. When I had told my dad that I was having an abortion, he said very little, as if it was no more noteworthy than having a tooth removed. I appreciated his overly casual reaction because I knew it was designed to make me feel better about my situation. Shirley just said, "It's for the best." For her, being fatalistic was a blanket policy in situations she deemed emotionally risky. When I got back to my dad's flat, I spent 24 hours curled up in the fetal position on the gold settee. For some twisted reason, I found the irony humorous. Although physically fine, I was mentally unwell, but aborting my fetus turned out to be an act of anguish so supreme that in a way it made me strong. From that moment onward, I knew I would never again feel that sad, or that desperate, or that low. But I did wonder how long the PTSD would last. The following day I went back to the flat I shared with Rob, who was sleeping off a hangover when I walked in. He owned his own business as a computer software designer, and so his hours were his. His partner was beginning to get pissed off with his indolence, but Rob didn't give a shit because he was the chief investor. As I nestled in an armchair that I had positioned so I could see the ocean, I began to wonder why I hadn't had the mettle just to politely walk away when I had first met Rob. I should have walked the moment I realised he was a boozer and a womaniser, which was about week 1. What had I seen in him? "He's not even funny," my mum had said. In early 1989, I found a rental flat a mile away or so that was right around the corner from my dad's place, and I loved that. Rob was at the pub when I moved out, and I took all his towels. Even though we were now living separately, however, Rob and I remained a highly enthusiastically dysfunctional couple for the rest of that summer. But as autumn approached, he told me that he had met someone new. The searing jealousy raging in my chest scared me. I had felt a lot of difficult emotions during the course of my life, but jealousy was by far the most ravaging. I didn't even care for my boyfriend, even thought he was a joke most of the time, but I wanted him for myself. I did not recognise who I had turned into, but the still small voice within told me I was being consumed by jealousy's 3 poisons: greed as possessiveness, anger as entitlement, and delusion. And in truth, if he dropped dead, I wouldn't have cared that much, which seems sufficient proof of all 3 infractions. Unfortunately, my emotions were too intense to rationally act on the diagnosis. Instead, I drove to the pub where I knew Rob would be. His new girlfriend was sitting by his side among a group of friends who were now my former friends. I picked up Rob's pint and threw it in his face, and then I picked up Andy's and threw that one in his face too. Rob didn't move. He was nervous. I left feeling satisfied, but only briefly. Then I felt disgusting. I also thought Rob was disgusting, and I thought life was disgusting. I drove away theatrically, spinning the tyres, recognising that, if I wasn't in the darkest place of my life, I was certainly in its suburbs. "What the fuck has happened to me?" I asked Auntie Joan's God as I put the key in the keyhole. "You're fine," were the only words I heard. "Go fuck yourself," I responded, understanding with embarrassment that I was now talking to myself. I poured a tumbler of red wine and knocked it back, and then I climbed into bed, hoping I might feel safe there. But my dreams were as ghoulish as my recent actions. In my dream, I was back at Whiston's Ladies' Hospital, reliving my abortion in a very cold and uncomfortable bed full of thorns that were digging into my flesh. I was wide awake during the whole procedure, and I heard the nurse say, "She is a stewardess. I wonder if she knows who the father is." And then I heard the doctor laugh. When I woke up the next morning, I shook my head rapidly from side to side to get rid of the dream, and then I prayed to Jesus for forgiveness. With shame and guilt gripping me, I then phoned Auntie Joan to confess. I told her about everything that had happened that summer, and all she said on the matter was, "It's okay, Duck. Jesus died for our sins. Come home for a while." I phoned in sick and went to Dodonall's for a week. I had to get away from Brighton and all the sordidness it represented. Auntie Joan was as solid as a rock, and Uncle Jim did his best to be sweet. He didn't say much, but I sensed he needed me to know that I was welcome and wanted and safe. His smile was paternal, not sexual. Tim had no idea of what I had been through, nor would have he understood, but he knew I was sad, and he played Argent's "Hold Your Head Up" on his stereo for me. I was very touched by this and appreciated my Somerset family more than ever. The guilt and shame I had been carrying around all summer began to dissipate when Auntie Joan began quoting St. Paul. "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful and will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way to escape, that you may be able to endure it."